Hello, my name is Billy Prater, and I am doing my media project on Chapter 11, Cinema Technologies, for the Com532 Media Technologies and Communication class. My goal today is just to kind of walk you through history. We all love movies. We all have our different types of genres or whatever, but my job today is to kind of walk you through to how we got to today. We're going to talk about why it's important. We're going to walk through the background, talk about the current trends, talk about what we like, what we don't like, etc. As far as verbal cues to change the slides, you won't need to because I've incorporated the PowerPoint into the background here. So I'm trying to use our technology when doing our technology. So you'll notice that the PowerPoint, if you do open it, is going to be the exact same as what's in the background. So please follow along. If you would like to follow along with my PowerPoint, if it's easier for you that way, simply change the slide when I change the slide, which I'm getting ready to do right now. So why study cinema technology? Basically, there's three reasons. One, watching movies is a great way to learn about the culture of a time, the culture of a country, the culture of a group of people. When you watch movies, it brings culture into play, and it's a fantastic thing. So we get to learn a lot about the culture we live in and a culture that from a time past, and that's really, really cool. Second, there's a social aspect. We are all tied into our favorite TV characters, our favorite movie characters, and the tie-in between the entertainment industry, the media, and us just creates a really nice communication aspect that I think is important when you're doing a communications master's. So looking at that social appeal is really important. And finally, the story. We all love a good story, whether it's told to us, whether we're reading it. We've always been captivated by the story, and movies are just another way to captivate us with their story. So let's start with the background. Basically, you had the camera. You had the still images. What you needed was to create the motion. Edward Muigrave, and I apologize for the pronunciation if it's wrong, created the Zoopraxiscope. And basically all he did was he was able to take pictures and kind of put them together. It's almost like, think of the flip book when you do the flip book and it makes it look like it's moving. It's that kind of concept. Very primitive, very basic, but it's kind of the start of the movie, which led to the chronophotographic gun, which has the same image, except you literally had a gun and you were shooting pictures rapidly. So instead of creating the pictures and changing the images slightly to change to make it look like motion, it grasped motion quicker because the pictures were taken quicker. The closer you can make something to real life, the better shot you have, which led to and excuse me here, let me get the name right, W.K.I. Dixon's kinetograph. And the thing that was cool about the kinetograph is, even though this was created well over 100 years ago, the basic technology is still the same. We have improved on a lot of things, but how this is set up, we really haven't. Your camera has 5 parts. It has the body, which is the entire aspect. It has the motor, which is the power. It has the magazine, which is what actually contains the film. You have the lens, which collects and focuses the light. And then you have the viewfinder that sends it out to us. And even though we've made all these advances, this part hasn't really changed. So it's really, really cool. Okay. What happened was we moved on to the French, and being a French teacher, I absolutely love this part. You had the Lumiere brothers, and what they did was they created the cinematograph, and that was it was actually putting all this together into one machine. The ability to take the pictures, the ability to move it, and put it all together, and they came up with what is arguably from a lot of people the very first film. It was simply a 1-minute film of people leaving their factory, as you can see here in the background. And that's what led on. People then wanted a story, okay? Because even looking at this, there's a story behind it. You see the guy in the white shirt. What should we know about him? You've got all these stories that you can go with. And it's just really, really, really cool. And so what we see is we wanted the story. And so you had Alice Guy Blaché, which is fantastic because you had a woman in a time where women still weren't treated as equals as they should be, who was actually advancing the narrative. She's kind of known as the mother of the software. So she was able to tell the story while all of these people were creating the images behind them. But you still had to create the story in your head. You had the lines telling you. So we had to move on to the invention of, and you'll see it also on the billboard, the Vitaphone. And what the Vitaphone did was it was a separate sound image thing. Sound image, that makes no sense. It was a sound thing that would attach and go along with the movie. And the very famous Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer was the very first movie with Vitaphone, as it's pointed out to you in the billboard, as I said earlier. And it was the first quote-unquote talkie. and it actually had the voices coming through to us so that the story was told to us instead of we kind of telling our own story, which led to life is in black and white. So Walt Disney helped to create Technicolor. Put a little arrow in there to show you where the Technicolor was. And his Mickey Mouse comedies, The Silly Symphony, was the very first cartoon ever done in Technicolor. So we could not make it more realistic, because the whole thing about anything we do with a movie or whatever is it wants to take us, we want to have the life aspect of it. And that's what Technicolor did, which moved on to one of the biggest problems that the cinema had was around the 1950s. The TV was being invented, and so people could get the same kind of entertainment at home. So what's going to be the draw? And that's been the question for the last 70 years. What's the draw to bring people to the movies as opposed to doing it at their home? As we get more and more advancements at the home, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, we get all these advancements. So How the West Was Won was one of the very first Cinerama widescreen. They created a brand new curved screen that created it wide that would give you an aspect of viewing movies that you'd never had before. And by doing that, they brought people out. They also invented 3D. I mean, who doesn't want to do things in real life? Movies have been 2D. If you could do 3D, you put on the whole glasses. You've got the one that's actually red lens. You've got the one that's cyan lens, and you watch it, and it's as if stuff's coming at you. And that's what this created, was this three-dimensional aspect. And this 3D aspect is what brought people to the movie theater, because that wasn't something you could get at home, which led eventually to the IMAX, which is still quite popular today, where people can kind of see things in 3D. Wings of Courage, of course, being the first one of those. Taking a brief break, a couple other things in the background before we move on to the recent developments that's extremely important. We have what's called the Miracle Decision. At this time, the government was trying to say that movies were a monopoly. We're talking the early 1950s, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court decided in their Miracle Decision was that this form of communication was protected by the First and 14th Amendments, and it was huge because it allowed people to advance technology and advance movies in a way they never had before. And then the last big invention that came about that was extremely important was the multiplex theater. You were moving away from the one theater, you're moving away from the drive-in theater, and people were getting, in the early 1980s, a chance to go to multiple theaters and create kind of sort of the theater experience. So that's kind of the basic background. So what moved on from there, the recent developments, we started getting into visual effects. Now, there's three types of visual effects. First is the mechanical, where you're trying to create wind and fog and all these weather elements, explosions. You have the optical, which takes images and combines them together. But the one I really want to focus on, because I think it's huge in the media industry, and what I found fascinating, is CGI, which stands for computer-generated imagery. And so now more and more we're putting what we create on the computer as opposed to what's actually happening into the screen. And the very first movie to actually incorporate CGI was the Andromeda Strain. If you see the Andromeda Strain, it has some really cool stuff in there. Then we moved on to what was called Dynamation, all right, and the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, which I'm going to be honest was not one of my favorite movies. Was the first one to use this, and basically it recorded from the rear and the front at the same time. And by doing this, it was able to create a more real life, because again, that's what we want with our cinema, is real life. Okay, and then the advancements are going to come quick here. We moved to the first 3D CGI because we want to keep that 3D going, and that was Future World, which came out in the mid to late 70s. And then we really started enhancing our CGI. Obviously, everybody knows Star Wars: A New Hope. Probably didn't have to put the title on there. That actually used Dijkstraflex. And what Dijkstraflex was that you could repeat the same movements over and over again to kind of create that rapid movement. And Star Wars was the first one on that, and that's why Star Wars still stands today as far as graphically goes. Then we move on to Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. And this was actually the invention of Pixar. This is where Pixar actually picked up and started. As you can see, if you remember the Genesis effects section, that 1 minute where the Genesis effects, where the planet was becoming a whole and going from nothing to something, that was the first totally generated visual effects shot. And it was 1 minute long. We included on that. One of the ones you've probably heard of the most would be Tron. Tron actually had about 20 minutes of computer-generated imagery through its visual effects, and so that's why it's kind of what's known as a visual effects, masterpiece, even today. And then we move on to Young Sherlock Holmes, which was actually the first photorealistic computer-generated character to full-length film. So they had a whole character that was computer-generated within the film. So as progressing, because Wrath of Khan was in 1982, and already in 1985, we're making huge advancements in the CGI and the visual effects world. Of course, everybody knows Toy Story, the very first all CGI animated film, every part of it computer generated. To finally Lord of the Rings, and I'm specifically focusing on Gollum here because we all know Gollum wasn't real. This was based on the motion capture suit, and what it was the suit, and you've kind of seen it in commercials and stuff now. People put on a suit and you capture their motions and then create it on the computer, and that's kind of where we progress to the point where we now need to move on to this whole digital age, because there's this huge thing with digital. First, we start with THX, and you move to Return of the Jedi. The first THX was released when Return of the Jedi came out in 1983, and it basically changed the theater because filmmakers now, and obviously in this case George Lucas, were creating films that the movie theaters could not handle. So if this was the trend that was going to happen, it forced all these brand new theaters to have all this new technology. And anytime you have this new technology that you're using and it changes the industry like that, it's hugely important. You also had the invention of Dolby Digital 5.1 surround sound. And I put up Les Mis here because it won for its surround sound. But basically, that's what you had going on, and you create this digital surround so that sound's coming all the way through you. It's stuff we still try to create at home, and that's why we have to figure out a way to draw, because as soon as the movies came out with it, now you can create a surround sound system at home so that it's like the movies. If you can get the movies at home, why do you go to the movies? That's become the issue. All right. Next, we talk about film versus digital. Attack of the Clones, which is the episode 2 of the Star Wars saga. Basically, do we want things on film or do we want things on digital? Long story short is digital is a lot cheaper. It's a lot easier for people to get into the industry because film is so expensive, to the point that Kodak a few years ago actually filed for bankruptcy because of the people losing film less and the expense that it costs. However, it's much harder to keep. You would think digital is easier to keep, but it actually isn't. Film is much easier to keep. So you have this fight on what you should do, and that's why we haven't completely progressed to digital. But we are trying to. You see the digital 3D. The first digital 3D was Chicken Little, if you got to see Chicken Little in the mid-2000s. And then you move on to the master himself, the guy who I think is probably most currently trying to change the way things are, and that's James Cameron. Everybody knows Avatar, everybody knows Titanic. In his Avatar, he created 2 different kinds of cameras. First was known as fusion camera, where he actually took 2 cameras and put them together to try to replicate your eyes, because we're trying to get as close as we can to real life. And this replicated the eyes. He also did the swing camera, which basically has the camera 360, so you never know where the camera's going to be. So you have to be fully into the character and fully into what's going on in order to be, because you never know what image is going to use and if it's going to be from the back, from the front, from the side. James Cameron is kind of an innovator when it comes to this kind of technology. So current status, basically we're seeing major price increases. 1, because of all the technology that's being used, and 2, because the industry is trying to stay afloat, and they're trying to find their target audiences. And what they're finding is there's a lot of people in the teenage range that use the movie theaters as a social aspect, so they're targeting a lot more, and you're seeing a lot larger increase in PG-13 movies because they can't get to the rated R. And you're seeing the 3D films because that is still something that you can't really replicate in the home. So you're seeing a lot of actual 3D films. Now, I know this book's a couple years outdated, and usually that's not a big deal, but when it comes to technology, it is. But finally, the factors to watch, the 4K plus. When you're doing the 4K plus digital cameras, what you're doing is a faster rate of speed. We've always been on the 24. We're moving up to the 48 because the eyes can actually handle up to 52. And so if you have a faster rate and you can move at a faster rate, it's going to be closer, and the eyes can still handle it. It's going to be much closer to real life. You, of course, have the HD, the high definition. Now we're going to move to an Ultra HD, which just kind of enhances things even more. It uses this 4K plus technology. I think it's the biggest thing you're going to see. And then there's light field technology, which you see a picture of. And basically what light field technology does is it doesn't just give you where, it gives you where the light's coming from. So it creates this 4th dimension that we can't create. So I look forward to reading your responses. But my question to ponder was, what was the most amazing visual effect you ever saw? And did you ever consider finding out how it was done? Or were you just so mind blown that you let it happen? So I do know this was a bit fast, but I thank you for your time. And I look forward to reading your responses. Thank you.